Hi there, my name is Ian Hamilton. I'm from the University of York in the UK. And I just thought I'd share with you some recent developments to do with controlled drugs. And a few weeks ago, the Home Secretary laid before Parliament some legislation which would allow a loosening of the regulations for controlled drugs. And controlled drugs would include things that you'll be familiar with, like morphine, or even a substitute drug that's used in the treatment of people who are opiate dependent, so drugs like Subutex or methadone. And clearly, what the Home Secretary was aiming to do in laying this legislation before Parliament was try and ensure that people who needed these stronger painkillers like morphine would have access to them, and that prescribers would be able to prescribe those drugs and pharmacists be able to dispense them. And when we think about what's happened with COVID over the last few months, clearly there's been a need for drugs like morphine because people can be in extreme pain or even in acute experience acute respiratory problems, breathing problems. And morphine is known to help relax people who are struggling for breath or are in extreme pain. So this was to the Home Secretary's credit in thinking about this, making sure that any shortages of the drug or any kind of bureaucracy in the regulations didn't get in the way of people receiving the treatment they needed in hospital or otherwise. Unfortunately, what seems to have happened is, while recognising the need for this, laying the legislation before Parliament, the Home Secretary has also stipulated that this legislation can't be activated unless it's triggered by her. So I thought this was a bit curious, a bit of an odd thing to do, given that we're in a crisis with COVID, and if now's not the right time to loosen the regulations around controlled drugs, it's difficult to imagine how bad things would have to be in order for that legislation to be triggered. Excuse me. So, along with 50 others, experts from around the country, we wrote to the Home Secretary formally and encouraged her and asked her to trigger this legislation. And we were fortunate to receive a reply from the Home Secretary. She also took the matter seriously and replied in a 3-page letter, which in essence said that she recognised what we were asking for, but nonetheless wasn't minded to trigger the legislation, and in fact suggested that responsibility for triggering that legislation excuse me, now lay with the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. So even though this was her decision, her legislation, she was passing responsibility, rightly or wrongly, to the Health Secretary to be the one who would trigger this legislation. Another part of her response was slightly curious in that she suggested that while the legislation could be triggered for the whole of England, it was perhaps more likely that even if it were triggered, the loosening of these regulations might only apply to a single pharmacy or a single GP practice. So in effect, what this means is if there was an identified need in, I don't know, a rural part of the south of England, it might only be one pharmacy in a small market town that is allowed to alter the prescriptions for morphine to ensure that someone receives a timely dose or the right dose for their needs, and that everyone else in England would then have to follow the existing regulations, which can be really timely, really bureaucratic, and very frustrating for clinicians, as well as obviously quite dangerous for patients. Any kind of delay to receiving treatment for pain, or indeed having your kind of shortness of breath treated, can in itself be life-threatening because it can trigger a cardiac arrest. So clearly that's not what anyone would want, and we're very keen to see this matter resolved as quickly as possible. But as I speak now, that's where we're up to. We've had the reply from the Home Secretary. We then need to consider if, for example, we then start almost all over again and write to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, and ask him to trigger this legislation. Now, what's emerged in parallel to this, because it doesn't, this regulations and law around controlled drugs doesn't just affect people with COVID, it also clearly affects people who are drug dependent and maybe receiving substitute treatment for drugs like methadone, with methadone rather, who've previously been or are dependent on drugs like heroin. What's emerged in the last week is that the Care Quality Commission has instigated an investigation into what they describe as a large national drug treatment provider, following the report from a whistleblower in that provider that there'd been an excess in opiate deaths in terms of the clients that provider was responsible for. Now, details are very limited, but what is curious about the CQC statement is that although they say they're launching an investigation, they are already intimating there is a problem with the provider in terms of them suspending daily pickups of methadone. And I can only imagine that was done by the provider to ease the pressure on pharmacies, to try and reduce the risk to everyone involved of contracting COVID, and the burden that places on clients who already may be in quite a vulnerable position in terms of their health, in terms of their mental health, having to go daily to a pharmacy to pick up a drug they rely on. So we'll see where that leads, but this, so where I started this video talking about the legislation around controlled drugs, as you can see, it already has developed into two quite differing but connected stories and outcomes. And if I can, I'll provide an update to when the CQC publishes the results of its investigation, although that may take some weeks. But just thought I'd make you aware of what's going on behind the scenes, as it were, in terms of what myself and colleagues are doing to try and improve the situation, both for people who are in hospital and in the community experiencing pain as a result of COVID, and also those who are opiate dependent. I'll try and provide a link so you can see the letter we sent to the Home Secretary and her reply to this video for anyone that's interested. Please do get in touch if I can provide any further information or if there's anything you'd like to ask. Thanks ever so much. Bye for now.